There was a serial sexual predator on the loose. And across 4 states on the eastern seaboard of America, women and girls were being stalked, assaulted, and raped. And the police had no idea what was going on. Until one morning, the investigators get a phone call that breaks open this case. Welcome to Crime Waves. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Crime Waves. My name is Declan Hill. I'm an associate professor of investigations here at the University of New Haven. And each week, myself and my students, and today it's Alexia Miller, we bring you the inside story of a criminal case from the investigator's perspective. And our guest on today's show is Lisa Dadio. Lisa was a senior detective and serious crimes investigator for the New Haven Police Force. She was investigating a series of sexual assaults that had no clues or traces back to their perpetrator. And then one morning, she gets a phone call from the forensics department. It is, in Lisa's words, a holy crap moment. And the cases start to make sense. Hey, good morning, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining us on Crime Waves this morning.
Thank you so much for having me back on again, Declan.
Hey, look, let's just crack on. Let's just get into this. You have, quote, a holy crap moment in an investigation where it just breaks open. Tell us about that moment, please.
So with this particular case, the holy crap moment was when I was notified as I was sitting in my office that the unsolved cases that we had relative to sexual assaults were connected to unsolved sexual assaults in Maryland, Virginia, and Rhode Island.
Wow. So this wasn't some neighborhood creep. This was a man establishing a reign of terror up and down the East Coast of the United States.
Yes, and you know what, Declan? It was unlike anything we've ever experienced in the city of New Haven. We've never had a serial multi-state rapist targeting women up and down the East Coast.
I'm dancing through this one because, as you know, in Crime Waves, we don't like to give publicity to perpetrators here. But give us a broad sense, without getting into the pornographic details that a lot of the other crime podcasts get into. Give us a sense of what was going on, please.
So, typically with these types of investigations, that being sexual assault investigations, throughout the country, most sexual assaults are perpetrated by someone known to the victim. Whether or not it's a family member, an acquaintance, somebody that they had met privately in their social circle, but it's known to the victim. And believe it or not, rarely, which goes against what most people realize, are these types of stranger danger sexual assaults. Those occur much less frequently than, those perps that are known to the victims. So what happened with us in New Haven is we had a few sexual assaults spanning over a period of time that were unknown perps. And yet there were some similarities between them, but a lot more that were not similar. So we really didn't think we were dealing with the same individual, but yet those similarities that existed between the cases made us think maybe we are dealing with one person doing these types of sexual assaults. Now, we did have, a couple years prior, we did have a serial rapist in New Haven, but he was committing the sexual assaults in New Haven. So in my time in the detective division, there were 2 times in 20 years that we dealt with these types of serial stranger
sexual assaults. And I want to emphasize the assault part of the crime. We're talking knives, we're talking broken bottles, we're talking, screwdrivers put to the neck of the victims. I mean, this is violence coming in.
Yeah, and it was horrible. Again, what's interesting, Declan, is our perp was much more violent early on when he started his crime wave of sexually assaulting girls and women, because some of the victims were under the age of 18.
Okay.
So he was brutal down, further down south when this whole spree started. When he had committed the sexual assaults in New Haven, he definitely put terror in our victims. Our victims had children. He threatened them that if they screamed, if they did this, if they did that, then somebody else that was watching over the child would kill the child. So that was the fear that he put in our victims here in Connecticut.
But there was a slight shift in the modus operandi, which is the reason why you don't immediately connect it with the sexual assaults in these other states.
Oh yeah, significantly. And honestly, we didn't know about those sexual assaults until I got that phone call from the forensic lab that particular day, when I was like, holy crap. What are we dealing with here?
Wow. So you're a major crimes investigator at that point, New Haven police. You've suddenly realized that this sexual assaults that you're seeing in the New Haven area is linked to this attacks up and down the eastern seaboard. You have no clues. You've got shifting modus operandi. The only thing you know is it's a stranger. There's no, connection with the coach or the priest or the father or whatever. How do you go about trying to solve a case like that?
So what we did, once we found out the connection, we actually reached out to those other states and the agencies where these sexual assaults. And in Rhode Island, believe it or not, it was a peeping Tom investigation. He never gained entry. He had done some pretty interesting things, and there was DNA that was found outside of what was probably going to be the suspected victim of a sexual assault at some point.
That is really creepy. So now he's stalking the women. He's presumably doing, the stuff outside as he's watching them in their house, plotting and planning the attack. Lisa, before we get into the investigation, let's make sure our listeners know the wide geographical range. It goes Rhode Island, it goes Connecticut. How far down the eastern seaboard does it get?
It goes down to Virginia. So it hits Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, and then Virginia.
Okay. So to the people who don't know the eastern seaboard, that's probably a little less than 1,000-mile span of places, different locations. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Tell us how you go about doing this investigation, please.
No problem at all. So, we reached out to those other agencies saying we need to sit down and discuss what you have, what we have, because obviously we don't have the particulars of anything. So Rhode Island was not part of this meeting originally, and probably part of it really had to do with the fact that they didn't have a sexual assault. They had a peeping Tom. And so their investigation was much more limited than what we had in New Haven and what Maryland and Virginia had. So myself and the lead detective that kind of was taking control of these investigations for New Haven went down to Maryland, and we spent a few days down there, and Virginia came up to Maryland, and we literally laid everything out and met for days talking about all of our cases and what we had. And they each, both Maryland and Virginia, each had a couple instances there that they had. And then obviously we had 3 in New Haven that we believe were all connected based upon the whole stranger danger thing and just a lot of the similarities that existed as well. But again, like the main MO, the modus operandi between everything was very, very different, which had us confused. And then a few months after that, Virginia actually came up to New Haven for several days. And, we were all working together, kind of brainstorming
And
suspectology.
to be clear, these, we now know there's at least 17 of these sexual assaults. There may have been many others, but they span over a dozen years. So it's not like July, August, September. It's like a long 1,000-mile difference, over a dozen years, dozens of different cases. So let me ask the question, how easy is it to get along with different police agencies?
So, we've had tremendous amount of success
Are you just saying that? Are you just being political now?
No, I'm not a political person. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm definitely not. I'm going to tell you the truth, whether or not.
So there were no issues of ego between various state cops and stuff saying, "Who the heck are you?" Why was that? Because that's pretty rare. I mean, at least in Canada, where I'm coming from, most of the provincial guys don't talk to the horsemen, which is the RCMP. There's all kinds of interjurisdictional fights, and everybody hates the FBI in America. So, at least in law enforcement.
I don't hate the FBI. In fact, I've worked with them several times in the past, and we had an amazing collaboration. So I'm not a hater.
Okay.
In fact, I can only speak to having incredible collaborations with other agencies for the 20 years that I was in New Haven. But I mean, to your point, I mean, I also know of times when there was fighting within our own state between agencies, when we had crimes that had spanned 2, 3, 4, 5 different jurisdictions, and yet who wanted to be the lead, But my experience was, in the cases that I've had, both on the sexual assault side, on the homicide side, on the shooting side, that we've always gotten along, and things went well. We have to put the egos aside.
So you're in the room with Virginia, with Maryland, now with Rhode Island. What's your plan?
So our plan is to try to figure out, who are we dealing with? Do we know what he looks like? Because in Connecticut, we had no idea. I mean, we had very general, non-specific descriptions of the perpetrator for a lot of reasons. I mean, the victims were sleeping, it was at night, you name it. And so, dealing with that. And it was Virginia actually that had a composite that was done when they had their rash of sexual assaults. And so we had decided as a collective agency, meaning Maryland, Virginia, and Connecticut, to let the media know we were dealing with this, because at this point, nobody knew that we were dealing with a serial rapist that was hitting the East Coast.
And that's a tricky question for you guys in law enforcement, when and if to bring the media in. Tell us about the pros and cons in general of bringing in the media into a case.
Well, the pro obviously is to get people to provide information as to the who.
Right.
We didn't know the who. Yeah, we had his DNA, but the DNA was not identified. There wasn't a who to tie it to. So, using the media is always a catch-22. You will get solid information. Sometimes you won't get solid information, but yet you have to follow up on every single tip that comes in.
Yeah, because the public, being nice, wants to help, and don't they provide you with a lot of times too much information that's just completely irrelevant?
Right, but we have to track every piece of that down. And so, and at the same time, like in this particular case, we believed there were other cases that had happened. I don't know how you skip New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina. Oh, that's a little further, but New Jersey and possibly Pennsylvania and New York.
Yeah.
And we're like, well, why were those states skipped during this 12-year time period? But, you have to look at a lot of different things. You have to look at whether or not evidence was ever collected. DNA is only as good as the evidence that is collected, preserved, and packaged correctly.
Now, there's a geographical profiler, a former homicide detective out in Vancouver, Canada, who put together the concept of geographical profiling. Everybody knows profiling psychologically. He's a redheaded 25-year-old who hates his mother, therefore blah, blah, blah. But he's like, let's link the geography of where the crimes is to the potential perpetrator. You guys were thinking in that same way. What were some of your theses and theories about this perpetrator?
Yeah, so again, looking at what connects Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, and Virginia together. I-95 is one. Major
Which is the main highway. Yeah, it's a main interstate highway that runs along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Yes.
Right. And where all these crimes had occurred were pretty much on and off the highway, within reason, but still easy access on and off to get onto a major interstate. So the other thing that is incredibly connected is military bases. The eastern seaboard is the home to military bases. So we were trying to figure out whether or not the lapses on when these sexual assaults had occurred had anything to do with deployment.
Of course, right. So he could have gone overseas, which accounts for the gap of a couple of years in the rate of sexual assault.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And honestly, that was our very first kind of the where. Like, it's the only thing for all of us investigators to think that we were dealing with somebody in the military.
Right.
Because again, why those states, why those areas, military, all through the four.
Right.
And so it made logical sense. The roadblock that we came up against, and me not knowing, never dealt with anything like this before, same thing with our colleagues in Virginia and Maryland, was that we had requested access to the Department of Defense DNA database that they use when officers and military personnel are killed in action. And it was refused because that isn't the intent of what they do. And they did not want to now become part of criminal databases.
So you've got the DNA sample of a serial rapist. It could be a military guy, and the military cops are saying, or the military officials are saying, hey, we're not going to share that with you. Okay.
Right. And so initially, I'm sure people are saying, oh my gosh, how can they do that? They're preventing. But you have to this was one theory we had, and there are other theories. And actually,
tell us about some of those other theories.
The other main theory actually dealt with that he was a linesman or he worked for Comcast. Like
what's a linesman?
Huh?
I know the football guy, the NFL.
Oh, so the linesmen would be individuals who work installing cable lines, phone lines on telephone poles.
Got it.
Or working for a media company like Comcast. And I say Comcast specifically because we had already researched whether or not Comcast was housed in Maryland and Virginia, and they were. So it's like, okay. And we knew they were in Rhode Island, and obviously we know they're in Connecticut. So then we're like, wait a minute. It could be somebody that works for Comcast. And think about it. How perfect is it for him to know? Like, that made more sense than military. Because
then he can spy on people. He can get a sense of which woman is living by herself or with kids and he's walking around the house.
And he's hidden in plain sight, right?
Yeah.
So he's working on a line, or he's installing, going into homes to install cable, and he knows exactly who's in there.
Right.
So then we really started focusing more on Comcast than we did on the military.
Now, eventually, this hits a roadblock. You've done, the trucker, the Comcast, the linesman, the military person. So then you decide to bring it up another level in terms of media involvement. Tell us about that decision, please.
Yeah. So, I mean, the decision was made, like we hit a roadblock. And
Right.
so it's all right. What do we do now? We have to find out, because in our mind, in New Haven's mind, we're getting ready for another attack to happen based
Yep.
upon kind of the time frame. So now we're all amped up on, we have to do what we can, because based kind of on the way he was hitting New Haven, we were concerned and we were coming down to where we were expecting another assault to take place. And we didn't want that to happen.
You don't want that phone call coming in. You do
No.
not want that. Yeah.
And I did not want another victim to be victimized. You know, I shouldn't
Yep.
say victim to be victimized. I didn't want another female to
Yep.
be victimized
Yep.
if we could have prevented it.
So
we went
you're
to the
at that
media.
moment. You're in trepidation every time the phone rings or whatever is happening. So what do you decide to do?
We go to the media again, and we put out all this information again. And I believe we put out another type of picture that we got from Virginia, because
Okay.
Virginia had amazing resources available to them that we did not have available to us in Connecticut, or in New Haven, I should say. And
So you've
since
got
they were already part of working together, and we truly were working this hard from two different parts of the country, we had decided to go with what they were also doing down in Virginia.
So Lisa, you get a composite photo from the guys in Virginia, and you put it on billboards up and down the I-95. What
And we
happens?
start getting information coming in.
And is it
And
good information?
Good information. And we follow up on that. And there was a call that had come in, or a contact that was made, that said, I think I know who person is. And again, I'm
Wow.
really making this incredibly simplistic, because it's
Yep.
much more in depth than that. And so what happened at that point, it happened to be somebody that was living in New Haven. And
Wow.
yeah,
Wow. So you got a serious suspect. And how long between establishing a serious suspect and making the decision to go full steam ahead with billboards up and down the I-95? Is it a matter of days? Is it a matter of weeks? How long does it take?
no, it's a matter of weeks
Okay.
that happened. So, again, looking back, it seemed that it went faster, but I really don't think it did. And we started following the individual very covertly. And I say it was the detectives that were assigned the case. They started following the individual, trying to get a DNA sample.
And he had no idea that he was being followed.
No,
These
he
guys
did
are
not.
good.
Yes.
There's a full surveillance team on him. He's wandering around his life, and he has no idea that there's been a tip and a linkage to him. And now this massive agency is looking at him, this massive, different police up and down the eastern seaboard. So
Yes.
what happens then? I mean, you're trying to track him, you're trying to get some information, and you're trying to get his DNA. What do you do? How do you do that?
He discards a cigarette in a public area while he's under surveillance. So the investigators hone in on that. They're watching it intently until he's out of the area, and they can kind of blend in and pick it up to collect it.
And excuse the ignorance. Is that legal? Do you need a search warrant to get somebody's DNA? What's the process in something like that?
So thankfully, what happened in this particular case is, because he discarded it in a public area, there is no expectation of privacy according to the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution.
Okay.
So the officers did not need a search warrant to seize it. And they could have, if they needed to, have done it's called a Joyce warrant, in order for that that cigarette butt to be analyzed by the Connecticut Forensic Lab. Again, but it was publicly discarded, so you didn't need that. There is no expectation of privacy.
So, in other words, if he had been smoking in his living room and stubbed out a cigarette, you would have needed a search warrant. And some of that might have had to be public, or at least you had to talk to a judge to say, we can't make this public. But
Yes.
because this particular suspect takes a cigarette out and throws it out in public, we're missing all of that. I remember, by the way, talking to our brilliant colleague, Claire Glynn, about the Golden State Killer. And very similar, as you know better than I do, the suspect in that case is driving along, takes a sip of some Starbucks coffee, and throws the cup out of the window. And their surveillance team in that case goes, bingo, we've got this. Now we've got the DNA. So you've got the cigarette, your colleagues have the cigarette. What happens then?
Obviously, they collect it, they send it to the forensic lab, and a comparison is done between the cases with the unknown, which is known at this point, and it's a match. It's our rapist.
And how long is that process? Is it hours, or is it goes into a bureaucratic system and 6 months later the result is sent to you by mail?
No, preliminary, and it's gotten much better. The technology has gotten much better, so it's pretty quick. But in order for the full analysis to be done, it can take a few weeks for that to occur. So again, keeping kind of him a little under surveillance while this is going on, waiting for the results to come back. We knew early on that it was looking like it was his, but at the same time, we had to wait for the official analysis to be completed and for the results to be verified by the analyst.
And I'm just shaking my head, Lisa, because that's got to be the most nervous 2 weeks or whatever of your life. You've got this.
Yeah. It was intense because we were so close, but yet so far, right? So, and while we're waiting for this, of course, the big part of this whole thing starts coming down, and sitting down and typing an arrest warrant, and working with our partners in Maryland, Virginia, and Rhode Island to, kind of put that information together, but not, because we can't arrest him in Connecticut for what happened in Maryland and Virginia and Rhode Island. They need to do those separate arrests. And so the investigators start working on their arrest warrants, and then obviously a subsequent search warrant as well. But, that was the whole big part to come, and just waiting for that last check.
And,
that
and
check
also,
mark.
knowing you, Lisa, there's also that tension. My gosh, what happens if he evades surveillance and he attacks somebody else?
Yeah, so
whoa.
That's always a fear. And you know what, Declan? We have that even in shooting and homicide investigations. Before we make an arrest and we know somebody's responsible, it's like you're sweating out the whole, oh my gosh, are they going to offend again?
Yeah.
And you pray that they don't.
Yeah.
And it's a risk that every single investigator throughout the country faces on a daily basis, especially when you're talking about these violent crimes.
And I guess you're telling the surveillance people, guys, this is, don't drop anything, like you got to be careful on this one. Okay.
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, Declan, I know it's you and I talking about this, but the work that the detectives who had this from the beginning all the way up to the end was truly amazing. And none of this would have been made possible without their hard work.
Yep.
Their dedication, their attention to detail, their perseverance, the ongoing collaboration. Because even when I originally got involved in this, years had passed and I was reassigned. I left the Special Investigations Division where this was housed, and I went to major crimes. So the investigation was still going on, even though I was no longer intimately part of it. It was the work that was being done by my incredible colleagues in the New Haven Police Department at the time.
The man gets arrested. There's a long backstory to this guy. It's the right guy. He pleads guilty. But I wanted to pick up on a couple of points. The first one is that we've got another colleague. We've got a podcast coming out with her work, Virginia Maxwell. And Virginia does work on animal cruelty as a child or a teenager, red flagging serious criminal activities on, a serial killer, murder, or whatever later in life. And this is exactly what we see in this particular case.
Yeah, it was. And again, looking at, you always want to try to figure out the why. At what point did things happen? Were there triggers there? Were there red flags there? And again, once he was identified and the investigators were able to truly dig into the who, they were able to get a lot more information on this individual.
Let's talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your work as an investigator, because I was doing my homework on this podcast, and I got to say, I'm really sorry to jump onto another thing. You were a cheerleader for 3 years. You were a serious competitive cheerleader for 3 years. And I'm sorry, it shows my stupid, preconceptions about cheerleaders. How did you go from being a serious competitive cheerleader to being a serious, tough, take no prisoner, senior investigator of major crimes?
Yeah. So, that fact, it was 3 years in college, and
Yep.
actually it was all of my grammar and high school years as well. So while I was a 3-year cheerleader at my university, it was at that time actually spanned. So, it's funny, Declan. Throughout my time in law enforcement, and even now, you hear these things such as, you're too pretty to be a police officer. You're too feminine to be a police officer. And that cheerleader part, believe it or
Yes.
not, none of my
Yes.
colleagues knew, because it would be like, it's like they don't look at you the same way, because you have this thought on who cheerleaders are, right?
I do. Yes.
I
And
know
that's my
everybody
issue.
does.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Everybody does. So people in law enforcement are like, how is that possible? Because of they know me in a no nonsense, very direct, lieutenant, head of the major crime division forever, had 100 people underneath me, no nonsense, in there through the trenches. And yet I'm a cheerleader. And, so it definitely was something interesting that I kept under wraps for a long time.
Is it, and I've spoken to other colleagues and contacts who are women in law enforcement around the world. What's it like being in that still heavily dominated, male-dominated world?
So, I like to think it was rough when I started.
Okay.
And it definitely was. And even though things were interesting, to say the least, being a female in a male-dominated profession, there were women who were trailblazers before I got onto New Haven.
Right.
Who really, I can't even imagine, probably had it tougher than I did. Because while things were tough for the many of us who got hired in the early 90s, they came on before that, when things were still pretty rough for women in law enforcement. And in fact, our charter, the city charter, didn't even refer to females as being able to be police officers. We were called matrons. And we were only supposed to work in detention and in dealing with juveniles. And that was it. That was all we were worthy of doing, based on a city charter. So, that kind of shows you how far we've come. So it was rough. And to say that it wasn't, it was rough, which is
Right.
part of the reason why nobody ever knew that I was a cheerleader forever.
Yes.
Because I didn't need them to view me as that kind of girly girl. I wanted them to see me as an equal part to them. Now, they have strengths that I don't have, and I have strength that they don't have. But we have to work together on that.
Did it affect, if you're a woman and you're tough and commanding, you get viewed in a certain way. If you're a man and you're tough and commanding, you get viewed in a certain way. Was it like that for you?
Oh, yeah. So, for women who are assertive, who take control, who speak openly, we are viewed negatively by a lot of people. And we're given a negative name, and everybody knows what that name is without me repeating it. It begins with a B.
It's the B word. And
it's the B word.
Is it both men and women view you in that way?
No, for men, it's viewed as being like a positive badge to wear and one of a true leader. And yet for women, it's viewed negatively. And honestly, that still exists. I mean, I hear it a lot, where more assertive women who are very direct are referred to as a B. And yet males are never referred to as whatever the counterpart to that would be. And it's unfortunate.
And that negative stuff comes from both male and female things.
Absolutely.
And I just want to state, the obvious, that the more diverse the police force, the law enforcement, the better it gets, because it reflects the society. You're going to get different perspectives, different viewpoints.
And we have to work together, no matter what our gender is, no matter what our race or ethnicity are. That shouldn't have a say as to how good of a police officer you are. And we need to be representative of our communities. Our communities are very diverse. Cities obviously are much different than your smaller towns, especially in rural America. But, when you're talking about medium and large size cities, your police department must be reflective of that city.
I don't want to mention any names quite yet, but we've got another guest coming on to talk about this in a similar theme. She was a teenage mother at 15 and went on to become a chief of police in a major American city. But she spoke about that perspective of being a teenage mother and the perspective it gave her, the experience it gave her, which none of her other colleagues had inside law enforcement.
Yeah, and being a mother in general in law enforcement is difficult.
How so?
Well, because again, we're viewed differently. So, for women in law enforcement, if you say you want to take the day off, or you want to take, you can't come in because of a sick child, it's viewed as being less than. But if your male counterparts who are dads were to say the same thing, it's never viewed negatively. And then you'll hear things such as, well, this is what you signed up for. I'm like, well, no, isn't this what everybody signed up for? It's not, why should my profession, something that I loved for 20 years and still love to this day, why should that be negated at all? Because I chose to become a mother when my amazing male colleagues chose to become fathers.
Yep.
And they're not treated the same when it comes to our children.
Now, we're doing this interview in December 2021, and let's go through a number of the startling statistics here. And again, neither you or I think are woke, politically correct people. We're people who care in the principles of truth and justice and getting the bad people and protecting our society. But what is the rate of women in law enforcement? Is it still less than 10%?
It is. It's been flat. It hasn't changed in 30 years that I've been involved in law enforcement. And that's terrible.
So for all the changes in the rest of the society, still in law enforcement, we've got an issue where 1 in 10 are women, and the rest of the society, it's 1 in 2. What advice would you give to a young woman who's thinking about that world, that career? What would your words be?
So my words would be, go for it. Don't get discouraged. It's an amazing profession. If you truly want to have an impact in the country, within your communities that you live in, to be able to help victims of crimes and their families. And I personally think it's one of the most rewarding professions that exists. And I'll always believe that for a lot of different reasons. To do it. Don't get discouraged because of the what ifs and the only 10%. Be one of the ones to make a difference and bring those percentages higher. we need more diversity across the country in law enforcement, and we definitely need more women.
This is my final question, and it's a weird and strange one, as you know, it would be from me. We started this case talking about a deeply screwed up, troubled guy who did a lot of evil things across states, to a lot of innocent women, and really caused an enormous amount of harm and pain. His father was a really unhappy policeman, a senior policeman in one of the things, and clearly took out a lot of pain on his son, who then took a lot of pain out on innocent people. Do you think having women in law enforcement could make the atmosphere and the environment of law enforcement less hard, less aggressive, still effective, still works well, but some of that just toughness less? Is that possible?
So, there's been a lot of research done on exactly that, that women are better negotiators, we're better at communicating, we're better at utilizing less lethal types of force because of our very nature. I will never say that I'm physically as strong as any of my male counterparts. We both bring different tools to the profession. But then again, I also know some women who can really hold their own and definitely be incredibly strong physically compared to male counterparts. So I think that there's a role for women in law enforcement, and that will never change. I think that we can do a better job as a profession to support women and minorities in law enforcement, and not have such a narrow view of what the perfect police officer should look like. Because it should look like the community. Yeah. And the community is made up of males and females and every religion and race and ethnicity that exists in our country.
Lisa, thank you so much for your work on this particular case, for taking and capturing this guy and protecting our communities. And thank you very much for joining us on Crime Waves Podcast. It's been a real honor, as always, to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Declan. The honor is actually mine.
Hey guys, it's Declan here. Listen, thank you so much for investing and spending your time with us here on Crime Waves. If you like this episode with Lisa Dadio, please do the usual on social media and like and subscribe us, and reach out to friends as well and let them know our work. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next episode.